Welcome back. After all the concepts and the terminologies, we're now ready to talk about the steps in audit sampling. I personally would like to summarize these steps in three letters: PSE. Plan, select, and evaluate. Of course, for us in the Philippines, it would be likened to the Philippine Stock Exchange, PSE, thus making us remember it better. But yes, plan, select, and evaluate. Now, in the many texts that you might have read about audit sampling, you would also know that there will be sub steps within each major step, but for ease of remembrance, let's just have these three. Let's start, of course, with planning. So, when the auditor plans for audit sampling, the auditor will need to decide between using statistical or a non statistical approach. Similarly, the auditor decides, should I be using an attribute sampling plan in the case of test of controls or a variable sampling plan in the case of substantive testing? But more importantly, it is in the planning phase that the auditor determines the population to use. Now, we are reminded, based on our glossary of terms, that population refers to the entire set of data from which the auditor draws out the sample. This also refers to the entire set of data from which the auditor would wish to make a decision or a conclusion on. Now, the population must be both appropriate and complete. Now, we say the population must be appropriate, ergo, it must be able to let you meet your audit objectives. And for us to know whether we're able to meet our audit objectives, then we have to take a look back to the management assertion that we are trying to test. So, therefore, we will know that the population is appropriate if it allows us to test the assertion that we intended to test in the first place. This is also where our discussion on the direction of testing will come in handy. For example, should your population be the entries in the sales journal, or should your population be the invoices, okay, that represent the sales? So decide on the appropriate population based on the assertion that you want to test. The population must also be relatively complete. Now, we do remember the definition of audit sampling, right? It gives each and every item in the population an equal chance of being selected. That being said, if the population is incomplete right from the very start, so those units which are not included in your incomplete population will then have zero chance of being selected, thereby deviating from the very core of audit sampling. So population must be both appropriate and complete. Now, there are many ways by which the auditor can gain reasonable assurance about the completeness of the population. One such way is, for example, to take a look at the inclusive dates, right? The start and the end date. Say, for example, if we're testing a calendar year, are there documents dating way back January 1 until December 31? Or the auditor might also account for the completeness of the pre-numbering of the documents to make sure that no such documents or months or periods are purposely left out. So that's the population. Next, the auditor should also decide on the sampling unit to use. Now, a sampling unit may be documents, they may be entries, or they may be peso amounts. So imagine, for example, if we are auditing accounts receivable. Now, one example of a sampling unit for AR testing would be customers or the number of customers. Now, each customer will have a balance. If you use the number of customers as a sampling unit, that's good. Then we also get to realize that, hey, each customer may have multiple outstanding invoices with our client, right? And so, therefore, it is also possible for you to use the invoices as the sampling unit instead of the customer. Further down the road, do you know that you could also use the peso amount as your sampling unit? That is what we call, or normally do that when we use what is called a value weighted selection or probability proportional to size sampling. That being said, the larger the amount of that particular item, the bigger is the chance of it belonging or being part of the sample. So decide on the population, decide on the sampling unit. The auditor will then determine the initial sample size. Now, the initial sample size determination will, of course, be affected by whether you use statistical or non statistical sampling. But regardless of which of the two you use, here are some general rules on the factors that would affect the sample size. In the case, for example, of test of controls, if the auditor has an increased reliance in accounting and internal control systems, the more you want to rely on the controls, then most definitely the more you need to test the controls, right? Because when do we test the controls? When we intend to rely on them. So therefore, your intended reliance has a direct effect to the sample size. The more you wish to rely, the more or the bigger your sample size will be. On the other hand, if you talk about an increase in the rate of deviation from the prescribed control procedure that the auditor is willing to accept, this will then remind us of what we have defined to be tolerable error. Since we're talking about test of controls, this is tolerable deviation, the rate of deviation that you are willing to accept, meaning this is the rate of deviation that you would still be willing to tolerate. So, tolerable deviation rate. And you would notice the more deviations you are willing to tolerate, the lesser or the smaller will be your sample size. Perhaps you might ask why. If you could perhaps match this one with our discussion on acceptable level of detection risk, right? The level of risk you're willing to accept and still be okay. It's basically the same story. The level of deviations you're willing to accept and still be okay. That's your tolerable deviation rate. Therefore, if you are willing to accept, if you're willing to tolerate a high level of deviation, that means that you are in chill mode, right? I'm still okay. There's a deviation of 2%, I'm fine with that. There's a deviation of 10%, not a problem. There's a deviation of 30%, I'm still okay. So, meaning to say, the higher your tolerable deviation rate, the more chill you are, the more relaxed you are. And the more relaxed you are, the lesser you would be testing. Again, because we are stating this in the tolerable level. Okay? The reverse is also true. The smaller the deviations you are willing to tolerate, the stricter you become. And the stricter you become, the more you would test. So therefore, tolerable deviation rate has an inverse relationship to your sample size. On the other hand, if you talk about an increase in the rate of deviation from the prescribed control procedure that the auditor expects to find. So if previously we talked about tolerable deviation rate, now we are talking about expected deviation rate, the deviation that you expect to find in the population. If it is expected, the relationship is direct. The more deviations you expect to be present, the more you would like to test. Okay, so, and you would notice this one even for substantive testing. If you're talking about tolerable, inverse. If you're talking about expected, then direct. Increase in the required level of confidence would be having the same relationship as increase in your intended reliance, which is direct. So the more, okay, the higher rather your required confidence level, the more you would be testing. Increase in the acceptable risk of over reliance. And for this, we need to take a step back and recall the risk of over reliance is a type 2 risk. And a type 2 or a beta risk is always scarier to the auditor. It's always more dangerous to the auditor. And like what we said, the auditor will always attempt to control or to reduce or to minimize type 2 risk. And because of this, the auditor will come up with an acceptable risk of over reliance. Have you noticed something? Whenever the auditor wishes to control a particular component or element, then we just attach the word acceptable. So the acceptable risk of over reliance. And this will have an inverse relationship to your sample size. So just imagine if you have a very low tolerance for type 2 risk, very low tolerance for type 2 risk, then of course you will be very strict, right? Because you can only accept up to this small level of type 2 risk. And when you're very strict, you will of course test more. The reverse will be true. If you have a very high tolerance for a possible type 2 risk, then you will be testing less. So, same concepts. Now, we talk about the increase in the number of sampling units in the population. Actually, in terms of the number of sampling units, this will have a negligible effect on your sample size. Same is true actually if you take a look at substantive testing. So let's start with the number of sampling units in the population. Number of sampling units in the population also has a negligible effect, except when the population is so small. Okay, but generally negligible effect. In terms, for example, of let's go now to the increase in inherent risk assessment and control risk assessment. In other words, if there is a high risk of material misstatement, then what do we say? Then of course we test more, right? A high risk of material misstatement would mean we'll have a low level of acceptable detection risk and therefore we'll be very strict and test more. So same as here. If there is an increase in your assessment of RMM, then you will also increase your substantive testing. Now, we also know in our previous discussions that there are many different substantive procedures, right? So, if there is an increase in the use of other substantive procedures directed at the same assertion, so you're basically testing the same assertion but using different procedures, then you may already decrease your sample size because you have already over tested that assertion. So, that's the logic behind it. Increase in the auditor's required level of confidence, similar to test of controls. This will also have a direct relationship to your sample size. And take a look at this. Increase in tolerable error would decrease the sample size. What did we say? If it's tolerable or acceptable, then the relationship is inverse. An increase in one would decrease the sample size. But if it is expected, take a look at the next one. Increase in the amount of error the auditor expects to find. So if it is expected, then the relationship is direct. An increase in one will increase the other. Increase in the acceptable risk of incorrect acceptance. So this is the type 2 version in substantive test. If in test of controls we have arrow or the acceptable risk of over reliance, right? Because the type 2 risk in test of controls is over reliance. In substantive test, we will have area, the acceptable risk of incorrect acceptance. And what did we say? If it's stated in the tolerable, the acceptable, the relationship is inverse. So when you increase area, your substantive testing will decrease. Now, do you remember stratification of the population? When we stratify the population, we reduce the variability. If you have ever computed for a standard deviation in your sample size computation, perhaps, or in your research classes before, perhaps, the standard deviation, no, the bigger the standard deviation is, meaning to say, the more variable the population is. So if you want to reduce the variability, you stratify the population. You group them into homogeneous categories. And this will have an effect of decreasing your sample size because you have already reduced the variability. Okay, so these are the factors affecting sample size for substantive testing. So we're done with P, planning. We now take a look at S, selecting. So let's now select, okay, the sampling units that will form part of our sample size. And this is where we will talk about probabilistic and non-probabilistic sample selection techniques. Now, we did make mention if the auditor utilizes a non-statistical sampling, then the auditor can use either probabilistic or non-probabilistic. But if the auditor uses statistical sampling, only probabilistic methods are available for use. So let's start with probabilistic. Now, you probably have heard about random selection. So that's a probabilistic sample selection technique. We normally do this one by generating random numbers and then matching the random number, for example, with a sampling unit. Or if you've ever tried maybe having a lottery or a raffle draw, so that's a random selection, right? So you will have random numbers and then you will locate which one belongs, okay? Which particular random number belongs to which particular document. So random selection. And random selection is normally the gold standard. Then we have systematic selection. And for systematic selection, this is where we compute an interval. And an interval is normally your your population divided by the sample size you would like to get. So say, for example, we have computed an interval of 5. So we will start with a random start and then every fifth item thereafter. Okay, so that is systematic selection. Now, the beauty of systematic selection is that, unlike random sampling, you could actually use systematic selection even if the documents or the sampling units are not consecutively arranged. Because if you can imagine random sampling, say for example, we have drawn out a random number, the random number is 128, and when you tried to look for 128, you notice that the invoices were not arranged in any manner, then it would be very difficult for you to find number 128. But if you use systematic selection, you can actually use the physical arrangement of the document or the sampling unit. So you could start with a random start and then say every fifth item. So it will be easier for you to find, right? The downside of systematic selection is that, well, if the items, if the sampling units are arranged in a pattern, then it will actually disrupt, no, the randomness of the selection. It will disrupt the probabilistic nature of the selection. So when you, for example, arrange the items in such a case that every fifth item always belongs to this customer, then you would most likely not be able to get a representative sample because there's a pattern involved. So those are the upside and the downside to using systematic selection technique. And of course, we have talked about stratification when you group together items of a similar characteristic. So normally, especially if you perform substantive testing, then you would perhaps group all items with account balances. I mean, all customers with account balances of 10,000 and below. That's one stratum. And then 10,001 to 500,000, another stratum. Above 500,000, another stratum. So they exhibit a similar characteristic. One thing one thing though that we need to remember, if you are using stratified sampling, whatever is the result of that stratum can only be projected to that stratum. You cannot project it to the entire population. So whatever misstatements you find in the stratum of above 500,000 can only be projected to that group. You cannot project it to the entire population. All right. Then there is what we call valuated selection, otherwise called probability proportional to size sampling. This is the one that uses the peso amount as its sampling unit. And this is when we say the bigger the amount, the bigger the balance, then the bigger the chance of that item belonging to a sample. You would then notice that there might be some weaknesses and strengths relating to value-weighted selection or probability proportional to size. Well, the fact that you get to automatically choose the bigger amounts would mean that the sample results in an automatically stratified sample as well, right? And it makes the audit more efficient. But the downside to this is, can you imagine what will happen if the balance is zero, or worse, if the balance is negative? And you're using that as a sampling unit, that, or if the amount is zero or the amount is negative, that means the chances of it being selected is zero or negative. So therefore, if the auditor uses valuated selection, there has got to be more focus, or there has got to be a special consideration to be made for zero or negative amounts. All right. Also, value-weighted selection is often used if the auditor suspects overstatement. This is more effective for testing of overstatements. All right. And then there is what we call discovery sampling. Discovery sampling is a unique type, a special type of sampling that we normally employ when we are performing tests of controls. Discovery sampling is designing a sample sufficient to allow you to make a decision that even if you find just one, if you're only able to discover even just one mistake, even just one deviation, then you could already decide on the entire population as having deviated. So that's discovery sampling, quite strict. Just one mistake, all it takes is one mistake, all it takes is one misstatement. The discovery of even just one mistake, one error will be enough for the auditor to conclude that the entire population is erroneous. So that's discovery sampling. Of course, that will only be used, or that will be used in special cases, such as, for example, when the auditor suspects fraud. Okay, so that's discovery sampling. These are our probabilistic sample selection methods. Let's now go to the non-probabilistic. So for non-probabilistic sample selection methods, there is what we call haphazard selection or haphazard sampling. So when the auditor selects items with no bias, no considerations whatsoever, that's actually haphazard. So imagine opening a drawer and then just taking out whatever document you will be able to find in that drawer, or whatever document your hand lands on. That's haphazard selection. That's not random sampling. Random sampling generally uses random numbers, and then you locate the item that corresponds to that random number. But for haphazard selection, you just pick out items or documents or sampling units without any conscious bias. So that's haphazard selection. And then there is block or cluster. So a while back, we discussed about stratified sampling. We group them according to a similar characteristic, right? But for block or cluster sampling, The groupings are heterogeneous in nature. If you can imagine, for example, 1 month, and in 1 month there are many different transactions and many different activities, heterogeneous. So that is block or cluster sampling. So stratification is homogeneous, block or cluster is heterogeneous. Okay. And then we have sequential sampling, which is again another special type of sampling we normally perform for test of controls. In the case of sequential sampling, there is no fixed sample size. That's why it's called stop or go sampling. It's like at every tranche, the auditor stops, evaluates the sample, and then decides, should I stop or should I go? Shall I make the decision now or shall I test further? Okay, so sequential sampling means there is no fixed sample size, and we call it stop or go sampling. All right. Now, what if the item selected is not appropriate? Well, if the item selected, if upon finding, for example, item number 111, and you realize, hey, this is not a sales invoice, it's not appropriate for the assertion I'm trying to test. So if the item selected is not appropriate, then replace the item. If the item selected is a voided item, you chanced upon a document, let's say, for example, document number 222, and when you found it, it had a marking on it that said void. Okay, if it's a voided item, then determine if the voiding is valid, if it is authorized, if it followed the appropriate processes. If it is valid, then you can consider it as part of your sample. However, if the voiding is not valid, then consider it as an error. Lastly, what if the item selected is lost or cannot be found? If it is lost, then the auditor should perform alternative procedures. If the auditor cannot perform the alternative procedures, then the auditor will consider it as an error. Okay, so that's planning and selecting. We will now move on to evaluating, but again, the evaluating phase is the one which will require a little bit of computation, so this might make the video too lengthy if we cram it in this segment. So I hope to see all of you in the next video, which is going to be exciting. You're going to need your calculators, so make sure you bring it in the next video. See you there.